In this lecture, we'll be going over the concept of the bias-variance tradeoff, a fundamental constraint in trying to understand the nature of the relations in your data using statistical tools. For this lecture, we're going to go over materials from chapters 1 and 2 in the James et al. Book, An Introduction to Statistical Learning with Applications in R. If you have not read these two chapters, please pause, go read them, and come back. We'll be focusing on two broad topics in this lecture: the fundamental form of statistical models and the bias-variance trade-off itself. Let's review the fundamental form of statistical models. In the lecture on data visualization, we went over the concept of a mapping between data and unstructured information to knowledge and wisdom. And in that lecture, the focus was on how to structure information visually such that the reader or the audience gains knowledge on the first pass as they decode information from your structured presentation of data to wisdom. Now, the same logic actually holds with statistical models and data science tools. It's the same logic. Somewhere in the world, you have unstructured information that you operationalize and use measurement theory to collect as data. From that data, you want to present some sort of structured way of understanding it. You want to compress the relations into an interpretable, meaningful understanding that you can convey to yourself and everyone else that allows for them to gain both knowledge about the principal relations and, over time, deeper wisdom of that information from the world that you're trying to capture. So in a very limited sense, statistical tools and data science models are another variant of this structured information. What you're doing is you're trying to fundamentally compress or structure the information that you have about your data in a way that doesn't require understanding every single observation in order to gain any knowledge. You want to have some way of providing a simple, intuitive understanding about relations across your observations. And that's essentially what data science tools and statistical models do. In the lecture on theory, we went over the concept of a fundamental form of a theory in psychology and neuroscience. In that, we described that any theory in these fields describes a set of capacities of a system: a cell, a human, a set of humans, rats. And this description of capacities follows the form of a theoretical function that relates some input to some output. Now, the fundamental form of statistical models, or statistics, follows this form very closely. It describes a set of outputs as some sort of relational function to a set of inputs. Now, the art of both of these is in the description of that functional relationship. You can have your inputs, x's, you can have your outputs, y's, but understanding how they exactly relate to each other in a meaningful way is what you're trying to do with statistics. And it's also what you're trying to do with your hypotheses and your theory. So the form of a statistical test, F, is a quantitative description of a specific hypothesis being evaluated, whether or not a p-value is calculated. So when you think about a statistical tool, you want to think of its form. And you want to think of its form in relation to your hypothesis, which was generated from your theory. Let's think a little bit closer about this. Recall again that you have some y, you have some x, and you have some functional relationship between the two. And normally in statistics, we have something called noise. Variance in your model. So you have the things you can explain and the things you can't. Y is usually, in most of our examples, going to be a vector of n observations, although with some of the tools we'll be working with later, Y can actually be a matrix. X is often a matrix with n rows and p columns. It can sometimes just be a vector, and in a lot of the simple examples we'll go over, it will be a vector. But more often than not, it's a matrix, where each column of the matrix reflects a different feature or variable that you're using to understand Y. Now, this is very similar to the concepts that we presented in the tidy data lecture. And you can see where the logic of the tidy data table, where every observation is a row and every column is a different variable, holds here. It's the same alignment in matrix algebra space. Now, the goal here with a statistical model is to compress information. So let's say we have some relationship between lexical errors on a task and age. Each dot here on the graph on the right reflects a single observation from a single participant. And your visual system can pull out a general trend, and you can see that visually. What you're doing with statistical tools is you're trying to compress that trend into an even simpler form using the language of mathematics. So, for example, we could describe this trend with a line. We could fit a simple straight line using a simple regression equation. You can tell that, that does well. It might be better to fit a curve, so use an exponential term, which we'll go over. But these lines, the orange line and the red line, are compressed versions of the data that abstract away a lot of the variability across observations in order to describe a general trend that can be broken down or compressed into a single equation. This y equals beta hat 1 x plus beta hat naught. You've distilled all of the nuance of that relationship between age and lexical errors into a line. So you only need that beta hat 1 and the beta hat 2. In this case, whenever we use a hat, we're inferring a fitted term. Those two terms are all you need to know because you can assume the form of a line. So all the complexity of these dozen or so observations gets boiled down to two numbers, these two regression coefficients, or three if we're going to talk about that orange line there. That's a substantial reduction in information you need to know in order to understand the pattern behind the data. Now, this structured form of this model, y equals f of x plus noise, is the general form of all statistics. And you might think that runs counterintuitive if you've taken an introduction to general statistics, where you go over different tools like ANOVAs and correlations and t-tests. But I can show you how any statistical tool that you're comfortable with that's specific for a specific problem actually boils down to this same form. So, for example, let's consider the t-test. The general structure of a t-test is shown at the top of this slide. So it's the difference between the means of group A and the means of group B over the pooled variance or pooled standard deviation of A and B together. So you can essentially say, is the distance between the two means, XA and XB, bigger than the average variance of these two distributions? Is the gap between the means bigger than the average width? That's essentially what a t-test is telling you. Now, this is the normative form of the t-test up here, but this can be rewritten as an equation that looks a lot like the form we had above. So you can have y, which is some set of observations, let's say reaction times, equals f of x, where x in this case is a binary variable that is 1 if the observation comes from group 1, 0 if it comes from group 2, and you can fit it as a regression problem. Beta 1 times x plus beta naught. So the t-test, even though you're probably more familiar as just the difference in means over the standard deviation, actually can be rewritten in this way as well. And we'll go over this in more detail when we go into linear models and ordinary least squares fits. But you can see I can do a t-test, and I can actually calculate out an exact t-value from this equation down here at the bottom by framing the problem as a normative statistical problem. Now, what are the goals of learning F? Everything that we will be discussing in terms of statistical tools and data science tools focuses down on understanding F, that functional relation between your inputs and your outputs. But there are two purposes by which you can use F. One purpose is prediction, in which case you want to learn f of x in order to predict a future observation of y from x. The other is inference, where you want to understand how changes in x associate with changes in y. The first concept, prediction, rests on the issue of control. You want to be able to take in new inputs, x, that you haven't seen, and have some control of your understanding of y. Whereas the goal of inference is gain an intuition or understanding of the relationship between x and y. Now, these are closely related to each other, and you'll see that we can often go back and forth between asking an inference question or asking a prediction question. But usually when we approach the problem of a statistical model, we're focusing on one or the other. Are we gaining an intuition of the nature of the relationship between x and y, or are we trying to find the best way to predict future y? And keep these two goals in mind as we go over more and more complicated statistical tools. They're all going to fundamentally rest on the same thing, and we'll go over later how you can take a prediction approach and use it to gain some understanding of inference, particularly when we get into model comparisons and model evaluations. Now, when we're talking about statistical models, we generally break them down into two types, and it all depends on the nature of your output variable y. If your y is quantitative, then we call this a regression problem. If y has a meaningful unit change relationship in its values with some unit in the outside world, is it continuous? Does it have measures that relate to actual differences in the outside world? So for example, lexical errors. A difference of 2 errors is meaningful. A difference of 3 errors is meaningful, just as the difference of 2 inches in height is meaningful in understanding tallness, relative to, say, 5 inches in height. If y, on the other hand, is qualitative or categorical, then it's a classification problem. There, it's more defining a state. Is y in state 0 or state 1? But the actual unit difference between 0 and 1 is meaningless in this case. So for example, if I'm trying to model accuracy where a single trial is either correct or incorrect, I'll use something like a logistic regression, where the change from 0 to 1 doesn't necessarily map on a unit change in my accurateness. It just says I'm in state accurate yes or accurate no. So these two critical distinctions are going to basically start to parse a taxonomy of classes of models that we will be going over in future lectures. And all it boils down to is the nature of y. If it's quantitative and continuous, you're doing regression problems. If it's categorical or qualitative, you're doing classification problems. Now, what about the form of f itself? What shape or assumptions do you take on f? Well, here we break down the classes of models as being either parametric, in which we assume a functional form of f that can be described by a small number of parameters. So for example, ordinary least squares regression assumes this functional form of your residuals. It assumes that y is normally distributed, which means that the error is normally distributed, which means that it follows this particular form of a Gaussian distribution. And the only parameters you need to learn are, in this case, beta 1, beta naught, and sigma, the variance of y. If you learn just beta 1, beta 0, and sigma, you can describe the entire complex relationship because you're assuming that it fits into this equation for the Gaussian distribution. And when we go over the proof for the ordinary least square solution in a future lecture, you'll see why this is. Now, the other class or form of F models that we'll be going over are non-parametric models. In these, you estimate F as close to the data as possible, but you don't assume a functional form. Whereas with the linear regression equation that we see in the top right, it follows the functional form of a Gaussian distribution. Something like KNN, or K nearest neighbors regression, doesn't. KNN regression, all you do to estimate or predict Y is estimate its nearest neighbors on some training set. You don't assume any form of Y whatsoever. You're going to use just the data that you have to define your prediction of Y in the future. So the critical difference between parametric and non-parametric has a lot to do with the difference between inference and prediction. But it also relays a critical distinction in terms of compression. Parametric models compress your data in an intuitive and meaningful way. They have lots of assumptions, but as long as your data fits those assumptions, you can compress the problem down to a set of regression coefficients or some parameter coefficients. Non-parametric methods, on the other hand, are difficult to do compression. You need all of your training data in order to generate some sort of a prediction. And so it doesn't have a lot of assumptions, but it's highly complex. So this relationship between complexity and assumptions, whereby as you increase the number of assumptions about your data, you can reduce the computational complexity of the problem, is important, and we'll keep coming back to it. Because there are some data problems you run into where you can't make the assumptions, or your data doesn't follow the assumptions of a particular tool. And a lot of times in practice, people try to just pigeonhole their data into statistical models where their data doesn't match the assumptions of that model, and that leads to a lot of the problems we have in empirical research. So when thinking about the problems that we're going to be going over the next few weeks in lectures, keep coming back to this idea that you have this delicate balance between creating assumptions in order to reduce your computational complexity or being more true to the form of the data, but having greater computational demands. Where this balance between complexity and compression really plays out is in the bias-variance tradeoff, which is a fundamental problem that you always have to manage with any statistical tool you will be using. This is essentially the fundamental tension of all statistics. In order to understand the bias-variance tradeoff, first you have to understand the concept of dimensionality in a model. A statistical model has two general dimensions to the data. You have the number of observations, and in this case, we're always going to be the rows of your vectors or matrices. So every row of y and every row of x is an individual observation. And you have the number of features or independent variables, p. So number of observations n, p, number of columns or independent variables or features you're trying to use to describe y. So that means that the dimensionality of a statistical problem is n by p, the number of rows by the number of columns. And specifically, as n approaches p, as you have fewer observations relative to the number of variables you're using to describe y, the dimensionality of the problem increases. So for example, here's one version of x on the left, which is just a vector where p equals 1. That statistical problem has a lot lower dimensionality than the matrix we show on the right, where we have 15 independent variables, where we have 15 features we're trying to use to predict y. If n is the same in both of these examples, then the matrix on the right is much higher in terms of dimensionality than the vector on the left. And in fact, in a lot of ways, this relationship between n and p has a fundamental limit. And we'll go over this problem a little bit later, but if n is equal to p, your model breaks down. The interpretability of your model breaks down. And when n is greater than p, you really can't fit that problem. And we'll go into ways of trying to reduce the dimensionality or compress that dimensionality and how to handle these high dimensional statistical problems later. But this relationship, this boundary relationship between n and p, fundamentally constrains the complexity of the models you can use to understand the relationship between x and y. So how do you learn this relationship between x and y? Let's say you have a reasonably low dimensional data set. How do you learn f? Well, you can learn f in one of two ways. Supervised methods or supervised tools find a model that minimizes a loss function on x and y. This is the type of learning we're going to be going over a lot in this class. So for example, this is what's known as the squared residual. So it's the difference between y and y hat. And remember, y hat is predicted by some function on x. So the square difference of y and its prediction from x gives us a fundamental error function that we use to fit, let's say, ordinary least squares regression coefficients. In contrast, unsupervised methods are ways of finding f independently of y. So what you generally do is try to find structured relationships within x itself, and that naturally has some relationship to y. So for example, here this is a clustering algorithms fit. And you can see it still has a loss function, right? Except the loss is between x and some mean of itself, mu I, right? Here, you don't necessarily have y in on the fit. You're not trying to minimize the difference between an output and an input. You're really just trying to get some sense of the structure of your input itself. Now, the bias-variance trade-off problem comes into play largely with supervised models. So let's focus on the problem of supervised learning in a little bit more detail. In most cases of supervised learning, essentially what you're trying to do is minimize the error between y and a prediction of y. And usually it's the squared error because you don't want negative values on your error terms. So we just use the square for simplicity. So remember, y hat itself is generated from some prediction from x. So here on the right, I'm showing that y hat is replaced by f hat of x. And I'm putting the hat over f to indicate that it's the fit function. This could be a regression function or what have you. Now recall, the assumption is that y was generated from some real-world version of f, given some inputs plus noise. So the ideal real-world version of y is essentially redefined as f of x plus noise. And we can substitute y in the error equation for this normative ideal form. So now we have that the error in supervised learning is trying to minimize the difference between f of x itself plus noise minus f hat of x squared. So you have the function of the real world, you have your estimated version of it from the data that you collected, and you have your noise. Now we can reorder this equation here, and what it does is it boils down to two types of error. On the left, we see reducible error. Error that can be explained by f of hat. This is error that you have control of in terms of your statistical model. So you can always keep figuring out better versions of f of hat that minimizes that error difference between the actual ideal model that generated y and the one that your data is trying to tell you explains y. You have control over this reducible error. On the other hand, that mean squared error of the epsilon term really boils down to the irreducible error. And this is error that you have no control over. We often just call it noise. So some things you have control over largely through access to x. Anything that's not in x but contributes to y, we call irreducible error. So you really want to boil everything down to squishing and reducing that reducible error. If you do as best as possible at explaining y, so if your f hat of x equals f of x, all that should be left over is this unexplainable variance, this irreducible error in your model. Now let's take a closer look at the reducible error, the error that you have control over. That itself actually has two parts. So we can further break it down into something that looks like this, right? You have your expected error. This is what you actually observe in your data from your model fit. And your reducible error breaks down into your variance of the model, how f hat changes with different x's and y's, plus the bias of the model, how well f of hat generalizes to a new sample of y, plus the unexplainable variance. So the variance of your variance of f hat x really is how it explains the variance within the data that was used to fit it. The bias is this generalizability. And balancing these two sources of error, and notice they add, so your variance plus bias means there's this kind of tension here in terms of trying to minimize your error. This is where the bias-variance trade-off sits. In every model fit you will be doing, and every model that you're generating and trying to use to understand your data, you will have to balance this tension. How much variance can I explain versus how much variance or things can I predict in the future? Let's think about this by example. Let's go back to that lexical errors by age data set that I showed before. If I have a low dimensional model, so let's say that I just use two features, an intercept and a slope. So p equals 2 here. This model has high bias and low variance. I've compressed the relationship between age and lexical errors into a straight line. So I have some degree of generalizing my predictions if I get new data, new observations in this data set. But it's not really capturing the nuanced form of the relationship between age and lexical errors. If I increase the complexity, I add in, let's say, a couple quadratic terms. So I increase the complexity and variance of my model. I might get a shape that looks like this, right? That's explaining more variance than just the simple line. However, I can go too far as I add in, let's say, 20 terms. You'll notice that this green line here is really just bouncing around with the individual variability in my data set. So what ends up happening is that it has a poor ability to predict new observations. It is too flexible in terms of accounting for the variance in the data that I have, so that it doesn't generalize to new observations. Whereas the first case, where p equals 2, generalizes quite well, but doesn't explain a lot of variance. Now, one term that we often use synonymous with variance is flexibility. And I think you can see how the term flexibility is appropriate here. The green model, with a high number of features in it, is very flexible. But because it's so pliable and flexible, it loses its ability to generalize. The low-dimensional models are less flexible, and they have high degrees of generalizability. So this is the fundamental trade-off. As you increase the flexibility of your model, increase its variance, you're going to reduce the bias, and vice versa. So your goal with any model fit is to try to find this tension, try to find a way to balance this tension between flexibility and variance and bias, so that you have a model that explains a lot of variability in the data set that you have and has the ability to capture or explain variance in future unseen contexts. So the way that this bias-variance trade-off is normally seen is by actually doing test-retest reliability. So for example, let's say that I have a data set on age and lexical errors, and I use it to fit a model with different complexities. So here I'm showing the mean squared error on the y-axis. Remember, lower is better. And the number of features of the model on the x-axis. Now, if I take just this one data set, which we'll call our training data set, and I learn a model, and I try different models with different complexity, as I keep increasing the complexity or the flexibility of the model, I keep getting better fits. The mean squared error drops. This is what you would expect. As you keep adding in terms, you're explaining more and more variance, and so your model fits are doing really well. Now let's say that I had another data set that I sat on the side, that I replicated my experiment, and I just took the fits from this training data set, the regression coefficients I got from these models with these different features, and instead of fitting them again, I just plugged them into the equation and I made a new set of predictions on a test set, a holdout test set. So this is new data that I haven't seen. I'm training on the green training set, but I'm trying to predict on this test data set. You should see something that looks like this, where as you increase the complexity or the variance of the model a little bit, as you go from, let's say, 3 or 4 features to 6 or 7 features, the test error will drop. But at some point, as you keep increasing the flexibility or the variance of your model, the test error will actually start to increase. What's happening here is that you're losing bias as a result of increasing the variance or putting more terms in your model. You're increasing the dimensionality, which makes it more flexible, which explains more variance in the training set, but it loses the ability to predict variance in the test set. And your goal is to find that sweet spot, that spot right in the middle where you have the lowest error on your test set and the best explanation of variance on your training set. That term there in the middle is your perfect model for managing the bias-variance trade-off. Every model to the right of that reflects overfitting. What you're doing is you're overfitting your model on your training set and explaining just unique variance in your training set, and it doesn't extend out to any other training set, or to any other data set but the training set that you use to learn your model. So your fundamental goal with any statistical tool that you will be using in your research is to find the right complexity of a model that balances the flexibility or variance of a trained model with its bias. You want to explain as much variability as possible in your current data set, but have a model that allows for you to hand it off to someone else and predict things in the future, predict unseen versions of your data that you haven't collected yet. That's the perfect structure of a statistical model, and that's something we're always going to be striving for in this class and in our research. So what should you take home with you today? Well, I want you to take home 2 points. First, the understanding of the fundamental form of all relationships in statistics. Y equals f of x plus noise. Every time you think about how to analyze your data, think of it in this form. Remember, this is an isomorphism to your hypothesis that was generated from your theory, which also has a similar form. So as long as you can constrain the way you think about the problem by constraining it to this fundamental form, your hypothesis and your statistics that you're using to test it should match up closely. You should start to have that intuition of their matching between your statistic and your hypothesis. Second, the best models account for reducible error in a way that explains the most variance while retaining the ability to generalize to new data. You always want a model that balances this trade-off effectively. Because the more that you overfit, the more you're going to be able to explain variance in your unique data set, but you lose this ability to generalize your results to anything else.